first of all, I said we probably should kind of review the situation a little bit from the standpoint of history. Now, this community, Rogers City, the village, and the county, Presqu'Île, and the school districts were all organized about the same time, same year, 1871, all organized by acts of the legislature. And the organization of the county government, the organization of the school government, the organization of the village government was all supervised by the circuit court of Alpena County. Now, historically, at one time, Presqu'Île County was a part of Mackinac County, then it was a part of Sheboygan County. But in the later years, it became under the jurisdiction of Alpena County. The prospectors, of course, that came in here seeking land for entrepreneurial purposes. One of the companies was composed of Rogers and Lark and Molitor, a land company developed coming out of Detroit. They bought certain properties up here, which later became the village of Rogers, and a village was laid out and plotted, and then, of course, their object was to get people to come up here, buy away the lake, and settle in this area. They could buy lots from them because they own the entire village area, or they could apply for homesteads in the surrounding townships that would later be organized into working townships, or in the areas of what you'd call Mulkey and Belknap and Metz, Bismarck and parts of Pulaski, or even Posen townships. Now, their object was, of course, to get people to come, and they did advertise. They advertised in Europe, and a lot of the people that came into this area were the immigrants that came out of Europe, especially eastern parts of Europe, around Pomerania, or near the Polish border. That's where a lot of the immigrants that came into this area right here came from. And now, of course, the homesteaders came in. I know my ancestors, great-grandparents, that's where they came in. They came in and by boat out of the Detroit area or out of the New York area. And most of us hit ground first at what's called Crawford's Quarry, where the Crawfords were the earliest settlers in this particular area. That's the area around the plant, or Michigan Limestone Chemical Company. And that area was known as Crawford's Quarry. And then of course, the first thing that they noticed about this area were two things. First, they noticed a tremendous amount of limestone that was right on top of the ground in certain areas, and then they noticed the tremendous forests. Well, the easiest thing to take out first, of course, were the forests. And so these early pioneers that came in became foresters, they became loggers. And they had timber, of course, immediately for sale. But now the thing was to get it out to the southern markets. And we had the development in the early days of the mills, the lumber mills. And those lumber mills were established right on the lake shore here, right in the village of Rogers City now. Some companies like the Lark Company had a mill, Molitor had a mill, Heft had a mill, and Lark had a mill. These were all some of the early pioneers. Those logs were brought in, turned into the various types of lumber of various sizes, and then the problem was to get it out. And the lumber schooners were asked to come in and carry the lumber to the southern markets, whether it happened to be Saginaw or Port Huron or Detroit or Toledo or Cleveland. There's a tremendous amount of lumber here that could be taken out, and so the mills were built right on the lake. And for a period of a good number of years, probably from 1920, lumber was the big, big item that went out of Rogers City. Now there were other industry that developed here. This was right on Lake Huron, and the lake was full of beautiful fish, trout, whitefish, suckers, perch, herring, chubs, and those, if you could get that fish to market, get it there fast before it spoiled, then a big fishery, quite a good-sized fishery was developed down here in what we call the fish dock area, right very adjacent to the present Vogelheim Lumber Company. The Vogelheim Lumber Company and Vogelheim Fishery were several of the early pioneers that came into this area. but timber, the mills down there. Now, by the time that I got onto the scene, the big timber mills that were so much a part of the early history were pretty well gone. And as a kid, I'd say 1920, 21, 22, those big mills were already shut down there. And because that big era had passed, and they started to shift about 1911, it shifted to another natural resource, which we'll talk about in a minute. But along with that, of course, with the industry came the other businesses of the town, and you had the development of the churches, of the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church and the Protestant churches all came in about the same time, around 1871. And the development of the early retail shops. Now, the first town grew up along what you would want to call the lakefront. And then First Street, Second Street, and then in the later years developed along what we call the main street today, or Third Street. But the early town was right on the lakeshore, which was only natural. Now, with the development of the timber industry, of course, you had the development of the lumber camps. There were several big lumber camps that were working with hundreds and hundreds of men out here in the woods, cutting down the pine, the white pine, the yellow pine, and the oak and beech and maple, and all the other timbers which had a very ready market in the South. The biggest job was to get the schooners to come in here to take the lumber out. And some of these people, like the P.H. Heft Company, had their own schooner, the Starkey, which carried millions and millions and millions of board feet of lumber to the southern markets. Those ships would come in, they'd load them right to the gunwales, as they said. So there were just practically floating lumber shops going downstate. And so it was very big business. Now, of course, with later on, after the huge amount of ready timber was down, then, of course, Rogers City was fortunate in that you had the development of the limestone company that came in here, because limestone was also right on the shoreline in the area what we call calcite. That was originally the name of that, was Crawford's Quarry. And then about 1911, you had the development of a company that came in to take advantage of that limestone, the Michigan Limestone Company. They came in with the idea of quarrying that stone and shipping it out by boat. Well, to do that, of course, you had to bring in a tremendous amount of equipment. And right after 1911, right about 1911, then the D&M Railroad came in. The D&M Railroad came in because the Michigan Limestone Chemical Company needed ready access for the materials coming in and going out of that plant. And so a spur line was built off the D&M track, which ran between Alpena and Sheboygan. Now, the D&M line had been brought up by Alpena through Cathro and Bolton and Posen, Metz, and South Rogers, Hawks, Millersburg, Onaway, LaGrange, Lower State Park, and Sheboygan. It was the main line. And so just a little bit outside of Posen, they put a spur in, going up through Pulaski and the southern portions of some portions of Posen townships, and it went into the Rogers township area, came out right across the US 23 today near the plastic plant, up between Swan Lake and Little Lake onto the beach and up into the plant property. And a tremendous amount of heavy equipment, of course, was brought in to build that plant on the lakeshore just outside of Rogers City. And from there on, of course, then eventually that railroad was extended on into Rogers City itself, which was only about a mile up the road, where the village of Rogers City had developed. Now, Rogers City developed where it was because of the lumber industry, and calcite developed where it was because of the limestone industry, but they were only about a mile and a half apart. And one of the first things that the plant did when it got there was to build a power company, electric company, because they needed electricity for the operation of the large shovels which were to dig the limestone out of the ground, and needed electricity for the crushing of the stone. They built huge docks down there so that boats could be brought in which would carry the stone. And so a tremendous number of the men who used to work in the lumber mills just went to work for Michigan Limestone Company. There was a ready supply of manpower available, but the community stayed in Rogers City. And as a result of that, a large number of homes had to be built in the Rogers City area. And at first there was a large number of boarding houses that were built in the Rogers City area. Some of those, like the International Hotel, which is still here, was built during that period of time. And there was the group, there were other boarding houses. There was the Thompson House, there was the Central House, there was the Kitchen House, there was the Reinke House, there was the Bayview Hotel. And then the plant took to building homes for their workers along 2nd Street, along up into the tank station area, along parts of 1st Street and Lake Street. They built just dozens and dozens and dozens of homes to house their workers and house some of their executive personnel. And with the development of the power plant at Rogers, at Calcite, to run their mills, then they had excess power, which they agreed to sell to the community of Rogers City, and a power company was started. That was located along Woodward Avenue between 2nd and 3rd Street. Part of that building is still there. And so they sold the power company. The power company then, of course, was organized, and electricity came into Rogers City probably along about 1914. They put up the lines, and then the plant supplied electricity, and they had a distribution point that came into Rogers City. Now the railroad, of course, also came into Rogers City. That was in 1911, at the same time that they came into the plant. They just extended the line into Rogers City. And I just put a little interesting note in there that the first train that came into Rogers City came in into a depot which was located on Ontario and 2nd Street. And it came in on December 18th, 1911. My mother said I beat the train because I was born December 15th, 1911. I beat the train by 3 days. Then later on the depot, first the depot was nothing but a boxcar at that point. And then later on it was built, the depot was built on the site which is now the Bowie Restaurant. And beyond that there was a turnaround for the engines that went up and turned around so that because this was the end of the line. The line didn't go any further than this. It didn't go up to Sheboygan. It didn't go over to Onaway. It just came in here, turned around, went back out. Now the main line, of course, going between Sheboygan and Onaway and Alpena, they were hooked up to Rogers City by way of the spur coming in. And then, of course, but for years before that, before the 1911 train, there was a stagecoach, regular Western stagecoach, where people from Rogers City would go to Hawks or go to Metz, catch the train, go to Sheboygan or go to Alpena, and passengers would get off and come into Rogers City in the same way. And now, I don't remember, but my mother said that on a few occasions, even after the train came in here, that she took the coach along with me and my older brother, and she went to Metz by stagecoach, because that's where her parents lived. The train didn't make proper connections, and so as a result of it, you took the stage. And but that was very common. These were regular stagecoaches that you see pictured in Western movies, and people. These things ran to catch the train because that's all the way they had worked. Now, the plant also had a special train that came into Rogers City every day to pick up the workers. They, I suppose, bought or rented a certain number of coaches from the D&M Railroad. And early in the morning, the train would come in, a little dinky or a little small engine would come in dragging pulling a couple coaches, go up as far as the depot, and people would get on. And they would stop every block as they went along. And I know that when I worked down there at the quarry in 27, 28, and 29, summer times, I used to just walk a block away from the house and catch the train going into the plant. And then later on, of course, that was given up when we got buses that picked up people from town, took them to the plant. You could ride to work for about 10 cents, or you could walk. But and then there were a few people that would drive automobiles. But in the early days, a good number of people, of course, rode the train, rode the dinkies, as they call it, or they call it the Kelside Limited. And that was the train, and then, of course, later on came the buses. There were in Rogers City, of course, a good, the community was growing, and homes were being built as fast as they possibly could build them. And now, the old town, as I say, originally the old town was along 1st Street, then it was 2nd Street, and then 3rd Street became the main line. And there were many of the old homes here around Rogers City are well over 100 years old. And some of the old business houses are over 100 years old. Like you take the Grambua hardware business, which is there today. That building goes back to about 1885. The same is true right next door, where McCurry has a real estate and abstract office. That at one time was the old bank. And that goes back to that era. Then there's the building where the Advance office is the publishing company. That goes back probably to 1885. There are a lot of old homes around town that have been here a good 100 years. Some of them probably been that further back. I mentioned the other day to a group that I talked to that they had a newspaper that came out of the walls of one of the early homes here in Rogers City. The whole piece of the newspaper was still intact because I saw it, and it was dated 1881. In 1881, a man by the name of Arthur was President of the United States. And that newspaper also mentioned something about an investigation going on about Custer's last stand up in Montana, where he got wiped out. You remember in 1876, Congress they had a committee that was giving a report on that, about what happened, why it happened. So they were 5 or 6 years beyond the fact then already. So, but you see, first we had the industry related to the lumbering. We had a big fishing industry here. And then, fortunately, we also had the limestone, which allowed the city to continue, and it continues up to this day. Now, of course, there's various times in the history of this quarry that, of course, you had a very big expansion of people that came in to work. I think one time the company had 6 or 7 of their own boats, which we call the limestone boats, that carried their product. And I understand that at one time they probably had as high as 1,300 people working at the plant. I know when I worked down there, they said there was around 1,000 people working at the plant. These were the summers of 1928, 29, and 30 in that area. That when I worked down there, they would hire the kids out of high school, 16 years of age. We'd go down and work for the summer, 8, 10 weeks, 25 cents an hour. The next year they gave us a raise, they gave us 27.5 cents. Now that wasn't bad pay for a kid. Nevertheless, they were ready takers, and I was happy to work. And I had other jobs that I did during the summertime. I worked with survey crews, and I worked with this county surveyor, Mr. Loud. And I also worked, one summer I worked at the bank, posting checks, running a check posting machine at the old Presqu'île Bank. And because that's where my dad worked, I suppose that's why I got a summer job there. But now, in the early days, of course, there was only one bank for many, many years in Rogers City. There was only one bank, the Presqu'île Bank. Along about the middle 20s, the Rogers City Bank started. That lasted a few years and then was absorbed by the Presqu'île Bank. And but today, I think we have 5 financial institutions in the community. So things change. Other people see opportunities to come in, and they did. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about my own remembrances of the early days in Rogers City. My memory was back pretty close to about, around 1915. From then on, I don't remember everything, but those things that I observed, people that I saw, things that I saw, are pretty much in mind. Now, there are a lot of details, of course, that I had to pick up on afterwards, but nevertheless, it starts pretty much in that era. I was, yes, I got in on the, what you might call the tail end of the horse and buggy era in the old town. And it's a period of time when there were more horses and buggies and horses and sleighs than there were automobiles. Now, there were a few automobiles even in the early days, probably around 1915 or even before. I don't know just who had the first automobiles in town, but I do know that in the winter period of time, after about November 15th, the automobiles did not appear. They were put up for the winter. Cars were put up on jacks, the batteries were taken out, and the people, the horses and sleighs, had rule of the streets. Now, there were a good number of homes in the Rogers City area, including my folks' home, that had a horse barn, which later on, in most cases, like ours, became a garage. But that's where people actually put horses in overnight. Now, why would you do that? Well, if you didn't have a car in the early days and you wanted to get out of town, you hired a rig. You went to the livery stable and you rented a horse and a buggy, just like you'd go to a Budget or other rent-a-car company in any place in the country today. You rented a horse, rented a buggy, and if you wanted to go early in the morning, you took the horse back to your home. Well, we had a barn, of course, to put the horse in. And the barn had a hayloft, and there was hay there, and there was oats there. And the next morning, if you wanted to go fishing or hunting or just go out the country to see the relatives, you just hitched up and away you went. And that was all there was to it. There were several livery stables in town like there were in any small town in northern Michigan before the days of the automobile. It was also the era of the blacksmiths. There were several blacksmith shops in town, and with a tremendous amount of horses, of course, in the early days, working in all of these lumber camps. That didn't make any difference whether it was winter or summer. The logs had to be moved. They moved by wagon or they moved by sleigh. And, of course, many of the lumber camps had their own blacksmiths out there. But the farrier business was big business. And we had at least three blacksmith shops here in town that I recall. One of them was the Bruder blacksmith shop, which is right across from would be now the bowling alley in that area. Another was the Walter Kelly shop, which was down on the property there. That home area is now owned by Larry Brusky, who has the Rogers City Home Furnishings. And another one was located just about where the Rogers City Floral shop was located. There was also a livery stable in that area. But blacksmithing the farrier trade was big business. And of course it still is today. Now, other things I recall about Rogers City in the early days, now I'm talking about up and down the Main Street areas and referring to all phases of the community, whether it's governmental, whether it's the churches, or whether it's schools, or whatever it is. In the early days, if you went down the street in Rogers City, you would hear people talking in German to each other, or you'd hear people talking in Polish to each other. There was a good amount of bilingual ability with the early people. In my own family, the language of choice in the first instance was German. My grandparents and great-grandparents all came from Germany, and everybody talked German. And as young people, My older brother and I got to be very, very fluent in German. But I mean, parents spoke good English, but within the family home sometime or with the grandparents, you spoke German. Some kids with Polish background, they spoke Polish. And a good number of people were bilingual. My dad, who was a banker, but in his early days he was a school teacher out in the Posen Metz area. And in certain cases, he said, practically he went into schools in the Posen area, and he said one time he had pretty close to 80 kids, and there were only 2 of them that weren't Polish. And so he picked up a lot of basic Polish words that became very, very handy to him afterwards when he went into the bank. Now, that doesn't mean that he was fluent in it, but he did understand a good number of the words. And I know my grandfather, who lived in the Metz area, he was one of the commissioners of the poor, which was a county job, the forerunner to the welfare system. Every county in the state had a commissioner of the poor. He was one of them in Presque County. And so he also learned a good amount of Polish. Now, naturally, German was his native tongue. Now, that doesn't mean that he understood everything. But if people came to see him, and they were Polish and he couldn't understand them, go to a neighbor who could speak it. That's what they did. And that was true also in other areas. In other words, but bilingualism was very, very common. Now, also about Rogers City, that's a little bit different than some of the communities, I suppose, and that is that in the town area, there were a large number of artesian wells. Well drillers came in, they drilled for water for the individual homes, and quite often they'd hit a flow. And they hit some dandies. My folks hit a beautiful flow when they drilled for the water of their home. The water was powerful enough so that it ran the water system for the whole house, including toilets. It was that powerful. And then, of course, you had some tremendous wells, like Kelly Well, which is now owned by Larry Brusky. It's still flowing at a very, very good rate, but that was a powerful, very, very powerful, what's called supplied water for many, many homes in the Lake Street area. It was pumped, but that was the water supply until the city water came in for many, many homes in that area. And in my immediate area along 3rd Street there, we had a flowing well. The Bertrams had a flowing well. The people next door by the name of Ewells had a flowing well. Nagel had a flowing well. Osgood had a flowing well. And so on down the street, there was a big flowing well right in front of what is now the Radio Shack. That was a big well there. And the various other places around the community where people just punching a hole in the ground. I mean, we're talking about here now. I think my folks' well was 100 foot deep. These weren't shallow wells, what I mean, but there was a lot of water underneath the area there. And these artesian wells, that's one thing that, and some of those things are still flowing. And but there were horse barns and there were livery stables, and there were hitching posts and hitching rails along the streets where people coming in, bringing their produce or coming in to visit would be able to tie up their horses back and forth along the streets. And now the streets, of course, were gravel, there was sand. The paving didn't start until about 1926 or 27, as far as I can understand, where they paved the Erie Street, and they also paved 3rd Street. The water, street water, what do you call that? Storm sewer. The storm lines were put in just previous to the time along 3rd Street that was paved. The streets were paved. Sidewalks, some of those sidewalks had gone in along about 1914 or 15, according to what my mother told me at the time. And that was very close to the time that they put in right after the electricity came into town, right at about the same time that the telephone system came into town in that particular era. Now, after, as we said before, after about November 15th, the automobiles were put up and the streets were left to the kids and the sleighs, the horses, and the horse-drawn sleighs. And sleighing on the hills in town, of course, was a very, very popular sport. That was the ideal situation because you didn't have to worry about running into any automobiles. You might run into the side of a horse-drawn sleigh, but it was pretty safe to do it that way. And the first traffic light, about 1928, the only traffic light that we ever had in town, that was put in just about at that time. So, let's see here. What else can I mention about those early days? I was going to say being sleighing. We mentioned this once before about taking a stage or taking a stage and going to Hawks or going to Metz to catch the train. Now, in the early 20s, those even though the stage was gone, they used to also catch the train. For example, I'll give you this. I remember watching the high school basketball team, probably about 1923, 24, in that era sometime. In the probably noon or afternoon, late in the afternoon, the basketball team would get on a sleigh. This is a horse-drawn sleigh, regular, just like you'd go on a sleigh ride. Had benches on it, and they would be taken to the going to Hawks. This was the coach and 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 members of the team. Take a team and go to Hawks. Time to catch the train to go to Sheboygan, because otherwise they would have had to leave all day. Caught the train there and went to Sheboygan, played a game of basketball, stayed overnight, came back the next day and caught the sleigh again that was waiting for them at Hawks. That happened, and also going south, the same thing. Maybe they went at a little different time, caught the train going south, and sometimes what they would do, they would go down, probably play Oscoda, they'd probably play Harrisville, and they'd be gone for 2 days. And then come back, and somebody would be there at Hawks or Metz or whatever the case might be to meet them and bring them back. Now sometimes you see they had to work around because the train coming into Rogers, so he just came in and went out. The train didn't go any further than here, as we said before. And the road didn't go on up to Sheboygan either. If you wanted to go to Sheboygan up until 1935, you had to go by way of Onaway. You went by way of Onaway and up through the fingerboard area, and then along the east side of Mullet Lake, and then to Sheboygan. And that's all there was to it. The train came in, went back out. So it was a nice thing after the US 23 was completed after 1935, when you could go direct between Alpena and Rogers City and Sheboygan. Now, like every small town, before the automobile became a very, very popular thing, everybody walked. Kids walked to school. Teachers walked to school. People walked to work. Now, we say if you went to the plant, you could ride maybe the railroad, or you could probably ride a bus. But nevertheless, people walked. Went to church, people walked. Ordinarily, within the framework of the town, if people were going to go visit somebody else, even on the other side of town, you didn't use that car. That car was for special purposes. That car was for Sunday use, or to go someplace. And it wasn't until afterwards that you couldn't go any more than 2 blocks, except that you had to get into a car. So it was a little bit different, because everybody walked to school, and very, very seldom would a kid have a car at school. Now you go up to the parking lot, and you have to build special parking lots just to handle to bring a car to school. Kids, they say they have to have wheels. They can't walk anymore. Well, we walked, and in many cases, kids walked, went home at noon, and back and forth. Didn't think anything of it. Today, it doesn't work that way. You have to you have to have a car, but that's the way times change. Now, let's see what else we can talk about here. Oh yeah, one other thing I wanted to mention before, and that is, in regard, or maybe I didn't, I'll do it anyway. In regard to the gazebo, which is in the Westminster Park, nobody seems to know exactly how that came into being. But we know it's been there for a long, long time. My mother says she knows it was there in 1908. And because that's when she came to town as a married woman. But there's no record as to just how that got there, where it is. It's been various places, but now it is in the city park. And of course there are many of those who say all over the country. And now also in the early days, until, of course we didn't have any TV naturally. Now we didn't have any radio really until about the mid-20s, when radios started to come into be a popular thing. The first radio that we had in our home, my brother and I built it, set out of a kit. Mr. Frank Ranke, who was one of the early electricians at the plant, was a radio nut, you might say, and he sold us the necessary supplies and equipment in kit form, and we made our own condensers and rheostats and the whole thing, put it on a board, according to directions, of course, and got headset phones and had a battery. My dad bought us a special battery, car battery, and by gosh, put the whole thing together, and darn thing worked. We got the station, there was very few radio stations, but the station that we got that most people listened to was KDKA Pittsburgh. And they played music, or there were speeches, or there were dramas that were put on, just a regular radio show, you might say. And then later on, of course, we started out, we had 2 headsets. Well, then there was a very simple device. I think at one time, folks had 6 headsets. So if you wanted to hear something special, 6 people could hear all at once. Well, then later on, of course, we expanded it, then finally got to the point where my dad bought a set, already made, already put together. But that was true with many, many homes. That's what you did first. You got the kit. Well, then afterwards, somebody finally got the things down to the place where you could buy it already made, and it was a wonderful adjunct to the entertainment. But one thing that radio did that TV doesn't allow you to do, TV allowed you to use your imagination. If there was a drama on or a play on, you used your imagination. With TV, everything is visual. Everything is right there. It's audio and visual, both at the same time. But with radio, you listened intently, especially if there was a mystery on. So that's all a part of the early life. Now, let's see, what else do I have here? Do I have anything else that I can bring in here? Oh yes, here's another fact that I wanted to talk about just briefly. This happened in about the early 20s. We had the development of what was called the Bradley Farms. Now, Mr. Carl D. Bradley, who was the president of Michigan Line, started a dairy farm right on the edge of town, right at the end of 5th Street. It is now called the Nagel Addition, up near the airport. There was a farm up there that was originally run by the Nagel family, and before that the Thompson family. And he developed there a beautiful dairy farm as a hobby. He brought in prize cattle, built big barns for the cattle and also for the storage of hay and other materials, a modern dairy house, modern, just everything right up to snuff. And they turned out milk for the entire community. That was his idea, that fresh milk for the people of the community. And it was ideal. He brought in experts, hired experts to come in from Michigan State, and they ran this operation for him. And it was very, very worthwhile. The only thing is it didn't make any money, but that was his hobby. So he didn't care whether it made any money. The only thing was that when Mr. Bradley died in 1928, that was the end of the farm. because who would want to take that thing over when it was a money-losing proposition? He had just too much money invested in it, so that the guy coming in after him couldn't afford to operate that thing, and the thing finally folded. And then the various farmers in the area picked up the milk business, and we finally had dairies established, and we had milk supply anyway. But before that, the milk used to come in from the farms in the area. There were milk deliveries by farmers that came in from the outlying areas, and it worked all right. I know my family, they bought milk from 2 or 3 farmers out there, or they bought buttermilk, or they bought eggs, and they bought cheese, and butter were supplied by many other farms in the outlying areas. And then, of course, the supplies started to come in more and more by fresh milk supplies coming in by train, and it got to be just a little bit different. But nevertheless, in the early days, it was very enough. Now, another thing that I wanted to remember here, I happen to think of some of these things that are characteristic of that era. In that era, in the summertime, between Memorial Day and Labor Day, many, many men, young guys and all guys too, in the community wore straw hats, regular straw hats. And that was the fad of the day. And sometimes on Labor Day, I've seen pictures of this, where at the Labor Day, if they were playing ball in Detroit, something great happened on the field, a home run or something, fellas would throw their hats away. And, I suppose somebody else picked them up, but nevertheless, the straw hat was the thing between Memorial Day and Labor Day. Another thing I just have thought about, of just little odds and ends of things about Rogers City. After the building of the high school in 2728, where it still stands there today, something occurred there. The roof of that building was a built-up roof, but it had a covering of about 2 inches of small pea gravel on top of to hold it down, to hold the, I suppose, shingles down, and tar paper. There's about 2 or 3 inches of pea gravel over that thing. Now, pea gravel is about the size of your little fingernail, and smaller, and some a little bit bigger, but nevertheless, it's all pure gravel, no dirt in it. And that was on top of that roof. That's a good-sized roof. And lo and behold, that became the breeding ground for the nighthawks. That's that small bird, about the size of a robin, size of a mourning dove. And they loved that roof. That was warm, of course, in the summertime. And they laid their eggs right on top of the gravel. And there were just dozens and dozens and dozens of nests up there in that roof. I was up there in that roof, of course, many times, because I was helping to do some of the maintenance. And in the summertime, if you went up there right after the little birds were running around all over the place up there. Well, those nighthawks, of course, would fly around town in the evening, and they make a beautiful noise as they dive for insects. It's just kind of a ooh. And that stayed on and on and on, and a lot of people didn't know there were those nighthawks were up there. We didn't tell too many people, but it was ideal breeding ground, simply because there was no rodents. There was no cats to get at them, no skunks to get at them, or weasels to get at them, and they just loved it up there. Now, there could have been some goshawks, but I never heard of the goshawks until the later years when they came into town here. We'd see them quite frequently in our backyard during the wintertime. But that's caused by the fact that a lot of people in Rogers City now, and all over the country, feed birds. At one time, there were only a few people in Rogers City, including my wife and I, who fed birds on a year-round basis. And but in the last 30 years of the feeding of birds, everybody's got a bird feeder. And selling a bird feed is big business. Before that, we went to the granaries and brought grain and cracked corn, which we fed to the birds. But with the coming of all of these birdhouses around Roger City and bird feeders, the hawks have moved in. You've seen them too. I've seen many of those goshawks in the backyard here killing birds. Well, that's what will happen. They have found out where the bird supplies were. The bird supplies were in town because there's a lot of food in town. So they came to town. But speaking about the nighthawks, some years afterwards, we had to replace the roof on that building after about 25 years. And there was nothing to do except to take the gravel off. That was a big job.